Hi, everyone. My name is Keerthi Nagothu, and I'm a cybersecurity professional with global work experience. I worked with consulting firms before my current role as security lead at Ballard Power Systems. My experience comprises building cybersecurity strategies, developing security initiatives, a cyber incident response, and risk assessments. So welcome to my session. Are you prepared to have zero trust model in place? So let's look at the agenda. So in this session, I'm going to give a brief overview about basics of zero trust, tenets of zero trust, logical components of a zero trust architecture. What are the challenges in migrating to zero trust architecture? A brief overview about zero trust model, threats to ZTA. So the references for this session are mostly from publicly available NIST website and also cisa.gov. So let's get on with the session. So what is zero trust? So the increased complexity of enterprise architecture as well as infrastructure with remote working has made perimeter-based security insufficient. Several attacks showed that once perimeter is breached, lateral movement is easy. So according to NIST, I would be calling zero trust architecture as ZT, is not a single architecture, but a set of guiding principles for workflow, system design, and operations that can be used to improve the security posture of any classification or sensitivity level. So a ZT architecture is an enterprise cybersecurity architecture that is based on zero trust principles and designed to prevent any data breaches and limit the lateral movement, which is basically the objective of moving from perimeter based security to zero trust architecture. So zero trust architecture is an end-to-end approach to enterprise resource and data security. So that encompasses person and non-person entities. So credentials, access managements, devices, endpoints, hosting environments, and interconnecting infrastructure. So to prevent unauthorized access to data and services coupled with making the access control enforcement as granular as possible. So key terms to keep in mind is no implicit trust is granted to assets or user accounts. Authentication and authorization, both the subject and the device are discrete. Implied trust to evaluating trust on a per transaction basis. So let's jump on to the tenets of zero trust or the principles of zero trust. So zero trust could be summarized as a set of principles or tenets as defined by NIST used to implement an IT architecture. So categorized into end devices, network, and data flows. All of the 6 pointers that you have, they can be categorized into them. And do note that all tenets or principles may not be fully implemented in their exact form. So if you look at the principles that deal with end devices, all data sources and computing services are considered services. So a network may be composed of multiple devices. So that includes employees' workstations, personally owned devices based on how the enterprise defines them. And enterprise monitors and measures the security posture of all assets. So no asset is inherently trusted. That is one of the principles of zero trust. So the enterprise evaluates the security posture of the asset when evaluating a request. So an enterprise implementing a zero trust architecture should establish a continuous diagnostic medication or similar system to monitor the state of devices and applications. So we will be looking at CDM when we're looking at the logical components of zero trust architecture. So what are the other principles dealing with data flows? So all communication is secured regardless of network location. So network location itself does not imply trust. Access requests from assets are located on network infrastructure. Example, inside a legacy perimeter must meet the same security requirements as access requests from any other non-enterprise owned network. In other words, trust should not be automatically granted based on the device being on the enterprise network infrastructure. Next is access to individual enterprise resources is granted on a per session basis. So trust in the requester is evaluated before the access is granted. And again, access should be granted based on the least privilege principle. So access to resources is determined by dynamic policy and may include other behavioral and environmental attributes. So an organization protects resources by defining what resources it has, defining its assets. So for zero trust, client ID can include the user account or service entity and any associated attributes by the enterprise to that account, or artifacts to authenticate automatic tasks. So resource access and action permission policies can vary based on the sensitivity of the resource or data. So least privilege principles are applied again to restrict both visibility and accessibility. So principle dealing with network identity governance. So all resource authentication and authorization are dynamic and strictly enforced before access is allowed. So this includes the use of multi-factor authentication for access to some or all enterprise resources and continuous monitoring with possible re-authentication and reauthorization. The next one is the enterprise collects as much as information as possible about the current state of assets, network, infrastructure, and communications. So an enterprise should collect data about asset security posture, network traffic, and access requests. So the above tenets attempt to be technology agnostic and help in the implementation of zero trust architecture. So having understood the tenets or the principles of zero trust, let's move on to the next one, which is basically the assumptions. So when I say assumptions, once you have figured out the zero trust architecture tenets or principles, we need to work with network with the below assumptions. Some of these assumptions apply to enterprise network and some apply to non-enterprise one. Example, devices connecting to non-enterprise one. Example, public, Wi-Fi, any kind of public cloud providers. So these assumptions are used to direct the formation of zero trust architecture. So the first one is the enterprise private network is not considered an implicit trust zone, as I mentioned before. So assets should always act as if attacker is present on the enterprise network. That is one of the key elements of zero trust. So this basically requires authenticating all connections and encrypting all traffic. And the next one is device on the network may not be owned or configurable by the enterprises. So visitors or any kind of contract services may include non-enterprise owned attacks. So this includes BYOD policies that allow enterprise subjects to use non-enterprise owned devices, which has become quite common these days because of remote working. No resource is inherently trusted. So every asset must have its security posture evaluated via a policy enforcement point before a request is granted. So not all enterprise resources are on the enterprise net infrastructure. That is again one of the key tenets of zero trust. Resources include remote enterprise subjects as well as crowd services. So the next one is remote enterprise subjects and assets cannot fully trust their local network connection. So assets should assume that all traffic is being monitored and potentially modified. All connection requests should be authenticated and authorized, and all communication should be done in the most secure possible way. So the next one is assets and workflows moving between enterprise and non-enterprise infrastructure should have a consistent security policy and posture. So assets and workloads should retain the security posture when moving to or from enterprise-owned infrastructure. So this includes devices that move from enterprise networks to non-enterprise networks, that is remote users. This also includes workloads migrating from on-premises data centers to non-enterprise cloud instances. So this basically gives an idea of how to implement zero trust with these assumptions being made. So let's look at the logical components of zero trust. So on this slide, you're basically looking at a diagram of how a logical component of zero trust work together. And this is from NIST. Again, once you understood the principles of zero trust, the network assumptions, if you look at the logical model, the logical model uses separate control plane to communicate, while application data is communicated on a data plane. As you can see here, control plane and data plane. The policy engine, so this component is responsible for ultimate decision to grant access to a resource. So the policy engine is basically responsible for giving access. so the policy engine uses enterprise policy as well as input from external sources. Policy administrator. So this component is responsible for establishing or shutting down the communication between a subject and a resource. So all throughout the session, I will be talking subject as something non-human entity. So that could be devices. It would generate any session-specific authentication and credentials used by a client to access an enterprise resource. Again, as I mentioned, policy enforcement point. So this system is responsible for enabling, monitoring, and terminating connections between the subject and an enterprise resource. So in addition to the core components that we have here, there are other several data sources that provide input and policy rules used by the policy engine when making access decisions. So these include local sources as well as external ones. So some of them are like, as I mentioned earlier, it's the continuous diagnostic and mitigation system. So what does this do? So it basically gathers information about enterprise assets' current state and applies to the configuration and software components. So it could have in the policy, an enterprise CDM system provides the policy engine with information about asset making an access request, whether it is running appropriate patched OS or the integrity of enterprise approved software components. And the next data resource is industry compliance system. So this ensures that industry remains compliant with any regulatory requirements that they fall under. Example, financial industry requirements or FISMA. So this includes all policy rules that an enterprise develops to ensure compliance. Again, threat intelligence feeds. So this provides information from internal or external sources that help the policy engine to make decisions. So the policy engine serves as a decision maker point, and all of these kind of provide inputs. So there could be multiple services that take data from internal or external sources and provide information about new attacks, vulnerabilities, and network and system activity logs. So this enterprise system aggregates asset logs, network traffic, resource actions, data access policies. So these are the attributes or rules and policies about access to enterprise resources. Enterprise public key infrastructure or PKI. This system is responsible for generating and logging certificates issued by enterprise to resources, subjects, services, and applications. So this also includes the global certificate authority ecosystem. ID management system. So this is responsible for creating, storing, and managing enterprise user accounts and identity records. The next one is the SIEM system that you would see in general as well. So this collects the security-centric information for later analysis. So this data is then used to refine and define policies and warn of possible attacks against enterprise assets. So once we have briefly touched base on the logical components of JTA, let's move on to understanding what are the challenges of implementing zero trust architecture. So as you are seeing on the slides, there are a few items like organizations' ability to migrate to a zero trust architecture because it involves heavy investment. They've already invested in legacy technologies, or absence of identity governance. And the next one would be like lack of ability or resources to develop a transition plan or a proof of concept, as zero trust is pretty new and requires a lot of investment. So there might be the organization, whether they want to invest or they want to move now or later, or they want to plan after 10 years is the decision maker there. You also have security concerns. There's nothing like 100% secure. So there are security concerns such as compromise of zero trust control plane itself. That becomes a single point of failure. And ability to recognize attacks and detect malicious insiders. Again, that kind of risk is always there. And interoperability considerations for zero trust architecture products or solutions with legacy technologies. For example, standard versus proprietary interfaces, ability to interact with enterprise and cloud services, user experience. So to date, this is one of the key items of zero trust architecture challenge, I would say, because today there has been no detailed examination of how a zero trust architecture could or would affect end user experience and behavior. The goal of zero trust architecture should be to enhance security in a way that is transparent to end user. So this is as quoted from National Cybersecurity Excellence as of October 2020. So let me remind you that these most of this data is from NIST and National Cybersecurity Center for Excellence, and these are quoted as of 2020 reports. So there has been a lot of research and working groups involved after that, which might require update to the documents, and also new inputs coming from the industry research as well into efficiently implementing zero trust architecture. So migrating to zero trust architecture. So implementing a zero trust architecture is a journey rather than a wholesale replacement of entire infrastructure. So an organization should seek to incrementally implement zero trust principles, process changes, and technology solutions so that it protects its assets. So how an enterprise migrates to a strategy depends on its current posture, the cybersecurity posture, and operations. An enterprise should reach a baseline or a benchmark before it becomes possible to deploy a significant zero trust focused environment. So there are two options to do that. One is pure zero trust architecture. So this is basically building a zero trust architecture from the ground up. In reality, this is really a viable option because for any organization with an existing network, there might be times when an organization is asked to fulfill a new responsibility that requires building its own infrastructure. And the next one, the other option or the more seen option is the hybrid zero trust architecture. So it's unlikely that any significant enterprise can migrate to zero trust in single cycle. It's going to happen over a period of time, and there might be an indefinite period where the zero trust architecture workflows exist with the non zero trust workflows. So migration to a zero trust architecture approach to the enterprise may take place one business process at a time. So that never happens just a cutoff. It more happens in more of an incremental approach. So introducing zero trust architecture to perimeter based architecture network. So before undertaking an effort to bring zero trust architecture to an enterprise, there should be definitely a survey of assets, subjects, data flows, and workflows. There should be a complete picture of what are your end devices, where is the data flowing, what is your network identity governance going on. So this awareness forms the foundational state before even planning for a zero trust architecture deployment. So an enterprise cannot determine what new processes or systems need to be in place if there is no knowledge of the current state operations. This is common for any kind of project where we do a current state and then a future state assessments. So some of the requirements that NIST has suggested as part of NIST 800-207 document is that there are around like 6 items that we can look at, basically starting with identifying actors on enterprise. So the policy engine, the key component of zero trust architecture, should have a knowledge of the enterprise subjects. So that could encompass both human and any possible non-policy components, such as service accounts that interact with resources. So users with privileges, special privileges like developers or system administrators require additional scrutiny when being assigned attributes or roles. So in legacy ones, these accounts have blanket permission to access all enterprise resources. This is one key aspect of zero trust architecture that they want to implement. Identifying assets owned by enterprise. So as I mentioned before, identifying assets and what are our assets, how do we protect them is key. Identifying key process and evaluating risks associated with executing process. So I would say it's another inventory process to identify and rank the business process data flows. Again, this is common across any other project related to risk management, where business processes are really relevant to the controls implemented. So evaluating the risks related to the key process is key. Formulating policies for zero trust architecture. So identifying, after the asset of the workflow is identified, identify all the upstream and the downstream resources that are affected by the workflows, because that kind of determines the entry into the organization or the enterprise. So identifying candidate solutions. So once the business process have been developed, enterprise architects can compose a list of candidate solutions. So some of the factors that they can consider is, does the solution require the components to be installed on the client asset? Whether the solution work where the business resources exist entirely on the enterprise premises? Or does the solution provide a means to log interactions for analysis? Again, it is needed because we are going in the feedback loop of inputting the data into the whole policy engine. And does the solution provide broad support for different applications, services, and protocols? Again, does the solution require changes to subject behavior analysis? The last one is initial deployment and monitoring. So once the candidate workflow and zero trust architecture components are chosen, the initial deployment can start. So the enterprise administrators can implement the developed policies by using selected components. So based on these, you can basically think of how to introduce zero trust architecture into the network. So if we look at the threats to zero trust architecture, so you're looking at subversion. So the list of threats have been mentioned here. So subversion of zero trust decision process. So in zero trust architecture, the policy engine and the policy administrator, as you have seen earlier in the logical components, they are the key components of the entire enterprise. So no communication between enterprise resources occurs unless it's approved and possibly configured by the policy engine and the policy administrator, which means that they become these components must be properly configured and maintained. So denial of so an attack on a P or PA could essentially compromise the whole process. Denial of service or network disruption. So if an attacker disrupts or denies access to policy enforcement point or policy engine or policy administrator, it can adversely impact enterprise operations. So enterprise can mitigate this threat by having policy enforcement reside in a properly secured cloud environment or be replicated in several locations based on the cyber resilience. Stolen credentials or insider threat. So the zero trust principle of no implicit trust based on network location means attackers need to compromise an existing account or device to gain a foothold into the organization. So attackers may use phishing, social engineering, or a combination of attacks or valuable accounts. So when valuable means based on the attacker's motivation, what is valuable to them. So it could be an enterprise administrator account, or for financial gain, they might look at financial accounts. Implementation of MFA for access request may reduce the risk of information loss from a compromised account. So, however, an attacker with valid credentials may still be able to access resources for which the account has been granted. Visibility on the network. So all traffic is inspected and logged on the network and analyzed to identify and react to potential attacks against the organization. So this traffic may originate from non-enterprise owned assets, that is somebody using their own device, or application services that are resistant to passive monitoring. So the enterprise cannot perform deep packet inspection or examine the encrypted traffic and must use other methods to assess a possible attacker on the network. So that is a challenge too, and a threat. And storage of system and network information. So a related threat to enterprise monitoring is the analysis of the component itself. So if monitor scans, network traffic, and metadata are being stored for building contextual policies, later analysis, that data becomes a target for attackers, just like network diagrams, configuration files, and other documents that should be protected. Reliance on proprietary data formats or solutions. So zero trust architecture relies on several different data sources to make access decisions. So including information about requesting subject, asset used, enterprise, and external intelligence. Use of non-person entities in zero trust administration. So artificial intelligence and other software-based agents are used to manage security issues on enterprise networks. These components need to interact with management components of zero trust, example, policy engine, policy administrator, sometimes in place of a human administrator. However, how these components authenticate themselves in an enterprise implementing zero trust architecture is still an open issue. So that is another thread. So if we move on to the next one, which is talking about zero trust maturity model. Again, this is from cisa.gov. So the zero trust maturity model represents implementation across 5 distinct pillars, where minor advancements can be made over time toward optimization. So the pillars include identity, device, network, application, and data. So to facilitate migration, zero trust maturity model can be described using 3 stages with increasing levels of protection and adoption. So as you could see from the figure, there are traditional, advanced, and optimal. Traditional is more manual configurations and assignment of attributes. It could be static security policies and manual incident response and mitigation deployment. Advanced is centralized visibility, centralized identity control, some least privilege changes based on posture assessments. Optimal, fully automated, assigning attributes to assets and resources. Cross-pillar interoperability, centralized visibility. So these maturity stages and more specific details associated with each pillar can allow organizations to plan, assess, and maintain the investments needed to progress towards zero trust architecture. Investment is key. So the following different pillars that you have: identity, device, application, workload. So each pillar includes general details about like what is the visibility analytics associated with each of them, and automation and orchestration and governance basically forming the basis for them. So lastly, if we see the gaps in the current state zero trust architecture, so the zero trust has been the most talked about word in the last couple of years, and the current maturity of zero trust components and solutions was surveyed during the research conducted in NIST 827-207, published in August 2020. So as part of this survey, the survey concluded that the current state of zero trust architecture ecosystem is not mature enough for widespread adoption. These are the issues that slowing adoption of zero trust architecture. As you can see, they have categorized from the survey into 3 categories. They had example questions and the identified gaps. So if I specifically speak about one of the current gaps in implementing zero trust architecture, one of them I already mentioned is basically the user experience in zero trust architecture environment. The second one is attacker response to zero trust architecture. So a properly implemented zero trust architecture for an enterprise will improve the posture over traditional network-based security that is established. The principles of zero trust architecture aim to reduce the exposure of resources to attackers. They or prevent lateral movement. The attacks also evolve as architecture improves. The attacks also evolve. So the open issue is how will the attacks change? So one of the possibilities that attacks aims at stealing credentials will be expanded to target. So when I say that, it's basically to compromise on the MFA and using phishing, social engineering techniques. Another possibility is that attackers will focus on the business process that have not applied the zero trust architecture principles. That is, they're basically following traditional network-based security. So in effect, it's basically targeting low hanging fruit in an attempt to gain some foothold. So as ZTM matures, more deployments are seen and experience case is again, the research is being done in the industry. The metrics over how the ZTA would be effective are being gathered, and there is a lot of research being done by NIST in terms of working groups and meetings where information is gathered and how ZTA would be implemented for organizations. Lastly, I would like to end the session with the references quoted here, where I have gathered most of the data from NIST publications as well as National Cybersecurity Excellence. And I thank you for giving me this opportunity to present this session.